The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Is freedom of speech in jeopardy today? It's supposed to be a foundational value of this and every other democracy, but many have observed it's in trouble. Tonight we'll discuss a new collection of essays called Dilemmas of Free Expression and ask, how free should speech ultimately be? Then, Nam Kiwanuka talks to writer and scholar Dara Horn about her provocatively titled new book, People Love Dead Jews, analyzing modern-day anti-Semitism. It's Thursday, December 9th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Across the ideological spectrum, there is concern that free expression is under attack, whether from misinformation and hate speech or deplatforming political correctness and gotcha pile-ons of every sort. Yet this comes at a time when rarely before have so many had the ability to express their views to an almost unlimited audience. Dilemmas of Free Expression is a new collection of essays exploring what threats to freedom of speech mean. Joining us, as is our custom, from furthest away to closest to our studio, 4 of those featured in the book. In the nation's capital, Carissima Mathen. She is professor of constitutional and criminal law at the University of Ottawa. In Kingston, Ontario, Dax Diorazio, postdoctoral fellow in political science at Queen's University. In Waterloo, Ontario, the editor of the collection Dilemmas of Free Expression, there's Emmett McFarlane, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. And in the provincial capital, Cara Faith Zwiebel, director of the Fundamental Freedoms Program for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the CCLA. And it's great to have you 4 with us on TVO tonight. I want to start off our discussion by just reading a paragraph from this book. And Mr. Director, I'll ask you to put that paragraph up and everybody can read along at home as they like. As the Supreme Court of Canada enunciated in one of its earliest judgments under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the freedom to express oneself openly and fully is of crucial importance in a free and democratic society. And as such, it is an essential value of Canadian parliamentary democracy. The protection of free expression is integral, the court outlines in another judgment, for seeking and attaining the truth, for participation in social and political decision-making, and for diversity in forms of individual self-fulfillment and human flourishing. Okay, nice words. Emmett, where are we in 2021 regarding, quote, the freedom to express oneself openly and fully?
Well, I think we're facing a lot of challenges. We have a discomforting percentage of the population that is susceptible to misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories. This is making it challenging to confront the real threats we're facing today, like the pandemic and climate change. We're facing a lot of hate and hate speech, particularly online and on social media. And we're in the midst of a climate where free speech as a liberal democratic value is actually itself subject to ideological polarization and contestation. And so I think, I don't know that I would label the problem of one of being a free speech crisis, but I would say we are facing enormous challenges about when speech is harmful, how to address that harm while living up to the ideals and values a democracy should hold dear.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you, because the quote you use in the book is, free expression is seemingly under threat. So I want to know if it's actually under threat or sort of under threat.
Well, I think it's under threat to the extent that there are now discourse and attitudes around free expression that we should be worried about. There's evidence that younger generations are much more open to censorship and restrictions on speech, more so than they used to be in a number of areas. We see controversies on university campuses around things like deplatforming and censorship that should give us some pause. At the same time, you know, if we compare Canada to most other countries, we would still say we have quite a strong, flourishing and receptive culture around free expression. So it's not all doom and gloom, but there are reasons to worry. There are reasons to remain vigilant about free expression.
Well, let's go back 40 years. And Carissima, I'll ask you to pick up the story. We got a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in this country 40 years ago. How well do you think that charter protects our free speech and free expression rights?
I think it protects freedom of expression fairly broadly in terms of the general interpretation of Section 2B of the Charter, in that very early on, the Supreme Court adopted an approach under which any attempt to convey meaning short of actual violence is protected by the Charter. But, and this separates us from Americans, for example, all of the rights in the Charter are subject to reasonable limits under the first clause of the Charter, Section 1. And that's why, for example, we have laws criminalizing hate speech, and we have some human rights codes that include the ability to make complaints against certain kinds of expression. And what the court has said is that while we value freedom of expression very highly, there are certain conditions under which the state, and it does need to be the state, can limit that expression, because there are other social goals that are very important. So I do think that we have powerful protections under the Charter. They are always subject to debate and delineation. There was recently a Supreme Court of Canada decision that ruled in favor of freedom of expression, but quite narrowly, and that's got a few constitutional scholars on edge, and maybe we can talk about that case that arose in Quebec. So powerful protections, but subject to, I think, some debate.
And a quick follow-up here. Do you find it interesting that our free expression rights are Section 2 of the Charter, not Section 1, Section 2? What do you infer from that?
What I infer from that is that the framers of the Charter wanted to make it clear that all of the rights and freedoms were not absolute, and that's why the first clause is the reasonable limits clause. But what I will say is that the fundamental freedoms, which are protected by Section 2, are the first ones that are mentioned. There's no legal relevance to that point, but it's true that if you read the Charter and you start reading it, the very first section is one that makes it clear that the rights are subject to some limits.
Curious, another distinction from the United States. Let's put some numbers up here. We've got a Post-Media Leger poll. Now, this is admittedly from back in July, but here we go. How do Canadians feel about the kind of free speech they have in this country? 45% apparently, 45% of Canadians feel very free to speak their minds. And if you ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, they say they're somewhere between an 8 and a 10. 45% feel the speech is more restricted today than it was 5 to 10 years ago. And 68%, more than 2/3 of Canadians, feel that some topics are too sensitive to be discussed. Let's pick up on some of this. Kara, what does it say to you that, and I'm going to infer from the first number, if 45% of Canadians feel very free to speak their minds, I'm going to infer that 55% don't. What does it say to you that more than half of Canadians don't feel completely free to express themselves?
Well, I mean, one of the things that it tells us is that there's a distinction between sort of the legal restrictions that exist on our freedom of expression and really the sort of societal ones. Emmett mentioned, that the discourse around free expression, and I think that that's where, you see people who think that being sort of censured on social media or being subject to ridicule or pushback from people about views that are expressed is a restriction on their free expression. In reality, that's just free expression in action, right? You have the right to express yourself, and people have the right to react to it. But I think, there's, and we see this in all different sorts of ways, even when you talk about something like hate speech, which has, a specific legal definition. I think the average person understands hate speech as something quite different. And they would think that there's a whole bunch of things that would fall into that category, which the law would say is not hateful expression. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect between what the law, says and what we as a society sort of speak about in our normal discourse. And to the point that Charisma made, you know, there is this clause in the charter that talks about reasonable limits, and our courts, you know, over time, they come up with different ideas about what's reasonable, and society comes to different ideas about what constitutes reasonable limits. So I think we're sort of constantly in an evolving state.
But I gather the point you're trying to make is that we have free expression rights in this country. We don't have consequence-free free expression rights in this country, right?
Absolutely. When we talk about free expression from a legal perspective or from the charter perspective, we're talking about, you know, what restrictions does the state put on us?
Gotcha. Dax, 68% of Canadians, if we go back to that poll, say some topics are too sensitive to be discussed in public. And I'm guessing there's probably a couple of different ways to interpret what that means. How do you interpret it?
Yeah, I think it's definitely indicative of something, even though I wish there were a bit more nuance in the methodology of that various polling, and also public polling more broadly about the comfort people have in voicing their views publicly within Canada, or actually anywhere in the world. I do get the sense that amid the polarization related to free expression, both on campus and in our broader culture, that people are only getting selective exposure to extreme ideas that might fall towards the poles of public discourse. And so without a really healthy state of public discourse, seeing the different varieties of opinions and different perspectives on topics, people might feel reticent to contribute to these conversations because their views will just not be taken on their own merits. They will then fit into the pre-established battle lines of whatever topic is being discussed. And I see this on campus quite a bit, where people's actual views don't really line up with the snapshot that we get within public discourse. And so, without a healthy state of public discourse, where people are exposed to a wide variety of perspectives on a specific topic, they're probably going to exhibit a propensity to tend towards an extremer opinion because they can't see the variety of different opinions. And they also might be more reticent to wade in because their ideas will be filtered through the polarization that already exists within public discourse. So I think those numbers are definitely indicative of something. I will say, finally, and very, very quickly, though, that a slight narrowing of the boundaries of free expression isn't always a terrible thing. I think if people are more thoughtful and more empathetic, and I think that gradually people have become hopefully more thoughtful and empathetic in their contributions to public discourse, slightly shrinking that latitude to allow more voices in public discourse is a good thing. And so the latitude for free expression, if it shrinks a bit over time historically, is not necessarily a bad thing. The question is whether or not shrinking that latitude is merited or unmerited.
No, I take your point. I mean, peace, order, and good government, which is in our Constitution, is also a Canadian value, and we seem to prize that rather highly. And that'll lead me to our next round of conversation here with Emmett, because obviously most of you spend a lot of time on university campuses, and university campuses, unlike, say, 25 or 50 years ago, today seem to be places where free speech goes to die a lot of the time. And, you know, I want to explore this a bit with you. A lot of students, it seems, don't want to be confronted by uncomfortable ideas. There are people who get invited to go to universities to give speeches, and then somehow those invitations disappear if people make a stink. How genuinely harmful do you think that the harm caused by uncomfortable speech or offensive speech truly is to students?
Well, I think we need to be careful with the premise of that question. Students face challenging, controversial topics every day on university campuses across this country without any fuss. My courses are replete with discussions about hate speech and hate, about racism, about abortion, about all sorts of controversial and difficult topics. And I've never faced a complaint for something a student said in a class. I've never had a student come to me and express concerns about language or offensiveness. And I think my classes are typical of the classes that are run by my colleagues. So I think we need to be careful of treating students as delicate little flowers who need protection. I think the controversies, the issues of deplatforming are the exception, not the rule. I think universities tend to have fairly healthy environments on that front. Now, the thing that concerns me is that I think we falsely pit free expression and values like equity and equality and diversity against each other. I think that's where the debate has been perhaps the most impoverished. It's not a choice between a free and open campus and a safe campus. I think what we need to do is make sure that universities are addressing systemic barriers to participation, that they're making sure groups that are often targeted by hate speech actually feel welcome and a part of the community rather than alienated from it as a result of instances of hateful speech. But I think those are systemic issues that can be addressed by other policies. It's not a matter of restricting speech. I think actually speech and free speech is imperative to ensuring equality and giving voice to people who currently feel powerless or voiceless.
Well, let me follow up with Karishma on that, because you've written that concepts such as harm and safety and violence have taken on ever-expanding meanings on campus these days. What are you referring to there?
Well, the idea that the perception of what is harmful to oneself now, in some controversies, includes just things that are said or ideas that are being discussed. And it's not just on campus at all. This is also in the political realm. And the issue then becomes the difficulty of adjudicating or deliberating on what that harm is and how it can best be addressed in terms of an initial allegation. And one of the things that's happened, I think, in the last 15, 20 years is we've had this enormous democratization of the means by which we express ourselves, which is wonderful, right? We have now the ability to reach many more people than would have been the case, but that also can have the result of amplifying what would have been quite localized, even mundane conflicts into national, international controversies. And that, I think, can have an impact on how university administrations approach a crisis or a controversy, and that they are now concerned that it could spiral out of control and reflect on the university in a very negative light. So that's, I think, an extra consideration that was not present, frankly, prior to the internet. Well,
Maclean's magazine did a poll on this, admittedly, again, going back a couple of years, but here's what they here's what they discovered on that front. 47% of university students surveyed wanted their campus to be open to all manner of speech and ideas. But 53% of university students wanted a campus safe from disagreeable ideas. Kara, what do you infer from that?
I mean, safe from disagreeable ideas. I don't even think I understand what that means. And I think that there's going to be, it's such a subjective idea of what we allow. I think that, it concerns me that people feel there's sort of a right to not be offended. And, we've seen even the case that Karishma mentioned at the Supreme Court of Canada, most recent decision on freedom of expression was a 5-4 split between judges who thought that a comedian's comments were protected by the charter, and 4 judges who would have found liability for what was understood to be artistic expression, a performance, a comedy performance. Not to say that it wasn't hurtful to the target, and not to say that people don't really experience the harm that they say they experience when they hear ideas that that put them at the center and that put a bullseye on their back. But that is the price we pay, I think, for living in a democracy, that we accept some level of offense, some level of disruption. Because in the end, it's better if people can can express themselves. And there's also a benefit, I think, to hearing. I like my racists where I can see them, right? I like to know what people think, and I think that's better than the alternative. But obviously, it sounds like based on that poll, it's a close to 50-50 split, and even a little more tilted towards the side of safety. But I agree, that with Emmett that it's a false dichotomy, I think, between safety and freedom. We really need one in order to achieve the other.
Well, okay, Emmett, I'm going to go to a fast follow-up from you on this, though. I mean, you told us a moment ago that your students are, I don't think you used the word bombarded, but let's say exposed to ideas that are uncomfortable and occasionally offensive, and we shouldn't treat them like snowflakes, and they can handle all of this. And yet here's the majority of students in this survey saying they want a campus safe from disagreeable ideas. I'm pushing back. What do you say?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they're answering a survey question that's giving them a false choice between two values. I think if you ask them in the abstract, do you want your campus to be free, we'd see overwhelmingly yes. And if you ask them, do you want your campus to be safe, they'd overwhelmingly say yes. I think, when it comes to the question of less freedom equals more safety, all you have to do is look south of the border, where states are currently banning the use and invocation of critical race theory as an example of less free equals less safe.
All right, Dax, let me bring you into this with the example of Ann Coulter. For people who don't watch a lot of American cable television, I should tell them, I guess, that Ann Coulter is some people call her controversial. Some people think she's pretty reprehensible. She has a lot of very unusual things to say. But 11 years ago, the University of Ottawa invited her to give a speech, and a lot of people raised a stink, and the invitation was rescinded. You looked into this case. What did you learn?
I'll just give a little bit of background before I delve into the case. So it seems like amid contemporary events where we can see in a really concrete fashion how there just are expressive harms that we ought to be worried about, people are less persuaded by perhaps a principled defense of free expression, some of the things that we outlined at the beginning of this segment. And so I'm really curious at looking at some of the strategic cases for free expression. Some might say that a strategic case for defending free expression is no defense at all. But in the face of not being able to persuade a not insignificant amount of people, I really do think examining strategic cases for free expression is vital at the moment. And so what I try to do in examining this case at the University of Ottawa is to ask first, what are the actual theoretical justifications for deplatforming? And my argument is that even if we have sound moral and intellectual justifications for deplatforming, I should say that rarely do we, if ever, have those on a campus, of course. That doesn't mean that there is a good strategic case for a specific form of restricting expression. And so if there is, for example, a harm reduction impulse at the root of restricting expression, as it was in this case, as the primary justification for deplatforming Ann Coulter, we really need to think through a bit better what reducing the impact of ostensibly harmful expression would look like. I think this is a classic case that's played out infinitely, in which we have someone who flips the script quite easily, garners the moral and intellectual high ground, is given awe-inspiring media coverage, and their ideas are given orders of magnitude more currency in contemporary public debate. And so if the impulse is to minimize the impact of ostensibly harmful expression, deplatforming often does quite the opposite. And so that's a strategic paradox that I think people really need to grapple with on campus and in our culture more broadly.
Let me follow up with Charisma on that, because I know she was invited in 2011 and you joined the University of Ottawa in 2011, but I don't know if you were there yet when she was there. Were you?
I was not, no. It was some months later that I was.
Some months later. Okay. Well, I'm sure it was a hot topic of conversation when you arrived on campus in December of 2011. What was the verdict on whether or not Ann Coulter should have or should not have been allowed to speak at that university?
I don't know that there was a settled verdict. It will shock you to discover. I think that in that moment, this was Dax's article is really helpful in that his chapter is really helpful in that it goes back and talks to people when they've had some years to reflect. I think in the moment there would have been people who absolutely thought that was the right thing to do. There would have been others, and I would just say I'm among them, who thought that the entire incident really backfired, and it didn't necessarily send the message that those who were opposed to what Ann Coulter says routinely would have hoped. And it's also very difficult to control the narrative that develops in the media and in popular discourse about what exactly happened in that instance, who was responsible for the decision. That was clearly played up to whichever side was recounting the story to their advantage. So I think a mixed verdict on that.
Okay, let me follow up with you, though. I guess I'd put myself in the category of those who think Ann Coulter is closer on the continuum to reprehensible than controversial. Having said that, do you think the tender sensibilities of the students of the day would have been overly damaged by letting her speak, say her piece, and as Kara just said a moment ago, you like to see your racists in full bloom in public so you know where they are?
I don't. I have a fairly high tolerance for controversial speech in a university above all other places. I do think that there is a role for protest. And this gets into a difficult relationship between the audience and the speaker, and what we call, for example, the heckler's veto. And there's all kinds of really interesting discussion about that. But in general, I think that particularly once an invitation has been issued, a university has to tread extremely carefully before it would ever revoke that invitation. And certainly the communication that was publicly offered that Coulter's speech might actually run afoul of the criminal code, I think that's also that's a weapon that you want to be very, very careful about employing.
Gotcha. Kara, let me bring you in here. The CCLA, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which you represent here tonight, has 5 core beliefs. The first 2 are equality and fundamental freedoms, equality coming in first. Is that the most important value?
So I would say, just like we often hear our courts say there's no hierarchy of rights, at the CCLA, we would also say that's true. And I work really closely with my colleagues and with the lawyers that we work with and with our board to try to reconcile these things, to work out how to achieve the right balance. And it's not always obvious, and it's not always easy. And certainly, there are people who think we are sometimes on the wrong side. But I think it is something that can be worked out, and I wouldn't put one above the other. And I think we have to realize that as much as we sometimes cast free expression as doing harm to marginalized people, to minorities, it's also been the tool for achieving equality. I mean, the right to protest, the right to speak out about injustice these are the tools that oppressed people have used to achieve great things. So I don't think it's one over the other. It's not easy. We were in court, not defending Ernst Zundel, but agreeing with his position that the spreading false news provision of the criminal code was unconstitutional. There are some who see that as, a loss for equality, but we believe that it's one of the ways that we can further the goals of achieving equality.
Less than 5 minutes to go here, and Emmett, let me bring you back in for a bit of a comparison between right and left on this one. You write that free speech is increasingly seen to be associated with the right wing of the ideological spectrum. And to be sure, in the United States today, the right wing seems to be far more interested in free speech, much of which is quite bizarre and quite wacky, but it is legal. I guess having said that, the question is, do you think the left has sort of given up on free speech as a prime, significant, core right of a democratic society?
I mean, I worry that there's a segment of people on the left who have decided to cede free speech as a value to the right-wing provocateurs who sell themselves as champions of free speech, while recognizing that they do so in a completely hypocritical way, right? So you're right. The right in the US and in Canada often leverage free speech as a value to say odious things, to say completely wacky things, but they're not actually principled defenders of free speech. And as I mentioned earlier, the right-wing governments in the US currently banning discussions of slavery and its systemic effects and critical race theory generally are proving the hypocrisy undergirding their views. And the left makes a mistake when it assumes that these free speech values is something that's pitted against equality and social justice. I actually think the hate speech law debate is a distraction that prevents us from making strides towards more equality. Because we decide, well, we allow censorship against odious individuals, that's fine, and then that's all we need to do. But hate speech isn't this linear thing causing hate. Hate speech is evidence of hate, and we're not addressing the root of hatred in society. We're not considering the more robust long-term policy measures that need to be made to try to combat hate. We're just combating a symptom of hate, which is hate speech. And I think that's a big mistake.
Dax, what do you say about that? Do you think the pursuit of those who engage in hate speech takes us down the wrong path?
Yeah, I think Emmett has made a really persuasive case, and I think it's a vital point to underline. To rewind just a bit, if we're trying to understand how approaches to free expression have changed over the last few decades, I think the most noticeable difference is that, particularly on the left, there is a much more intense and noticeable skepticism of free expression, not just on campus, but in broader society and culture. I think at the root of that is some added nuance or complexity to this concept of harm. The problem is that universities and other institutions have essentially adopted the position that any invocation of harm necessarily means that there needs to be a restriction of expression somehow. So the mere invocation of harm means that there should be some form of expressive restriction. I think that we can actually do two things at once. I think that we can recognize that expressive harms, and they are real, material, and concrete, are distributed disproportionately, and that's incredibly unfortunate. And we should do our best to mitigate that and do as Emmett said, which is address the systemic roots of things like hate in society. So we can recognize that while also recognizing that we need open and free inquiry and debate within Canada and around the world. So I don't think that these normative principles to which we should strive are in endless conflict on campus or anywhere else.
Well, we have enjoyed hearing you speak freely about this issue tonight on TVO, so thanks to Cara Faith Zwiebel from the CCLA, Carissima Mathen from the University of Ottawa, Emmett McFarlane, the editor of Dilemmas of Free Expression from the University of Waterloo, and Dax D'Orazio, the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University in Kingston. We're grateful to all of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views on this. Many thanks.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Few book titles will stop you in your tracks as writer Dara Horn's new collection of essays does. It's called People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present. And the title is just the beginning of a powerful analysis that will make you think and rethink representations of Jewish history and people from Shakespeare to Anne Frank and beyond. It's been named to many Best of 2021 book lists, and we're pleased to bring Dara Horn to our airwaves tonight from Short Hills, New Jersey. Hi, Dara. It's really nice to meet you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So before we started this interview, I said, you know, that title, it felt wrong for me to say it out loud. Why call this book that?
Well, if the title makes you uncomfortable, then you will be even more uncomfortable once you find out what is inside the book. My intention was to make people uncomfortable because the overarching idea in this book is that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves, and that usually involve erasing living Jews in the process. And that is what I was trying to call attention to. And so much of that process is only made possible by living Jews being forced to sort of like make other people feel comfortable about this problem. And that was what I'm sort of turning on its head by naming this book this rather audacious title.
What's been the reaction to the book?
I actually have been, I would say, pleasantly surprised, except it's not so pleasant. The reaction has been really overwhelming. I find that I have a lot of non-Jewish readers who are just sort of stunned, did not really appreciate the kind of problem this was, had no idea what was happening with that. I have many non-Jewish readers who feel like reading this book, they say this book is familiar to me from my own experience as a member of another minority or from experiences in my life where I felt the need to erase myself. And then I have many, many Jewish readers who have contacted me and sort of said, like, I have felt uncomfortable about this my entire life, and now someone has finally said it. Thank you. So I'll tell you that it's my sixth book. It's always nice when you have readers who appreciate your work, but in this case, I kind of wish readers liked this book a little bit less.
Why is that?
Because it shows me that, this problem really was not all in my head. Like, this really is something that's very pervasive in our society.
And you work through some of these things that you've been thinking about for a very long time, but society has been telling you, oh, no, you have this kind of backwards. And you share a story of something that happened when you were younger, and you were with a group of young women, and they were surprised when you said that you were Jewish because they didn't think that you looked the way that Jews are supposed to look, because that's not how Hitler described them. I wanted to read just an excerpt from the book of what you write. So you write, like most people in the world, they had only encountered dead Jews, people whose sole attribute was that they had been murdered and whose murders served a clear purpose, which was to teach us something. Jews were people who, for moral and educational purposes, were supposed to be dead. You also shared that you felt haunted. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I want to point out in that passage really is that these people were not they weren't stupid. They weren't ignorant. They just had received this message that non-Jewish societies teach about Jews, which is Jews are people who were murdered, and that's it. And when I say I often felt haunted, my academic work is in Yiddish and Hebrew literature. It is true that Jewish history does have this sort of litany of persecutions that's part of it. And that's, you sort of can't really live your life as a Jew without having that be part of your life. But the reality, though, is that what's amazing about Jewish history is that not this history of persecution, but the history of resilience and endurance, and how this weaves its way as sort of this counterculture throughout the history of the West. And that's what these students really were missing, by thinking that Jews were sort of like this, people who were supposed to teach us something nice about humanity, as opposed to this sort of astounding culture that's a masterclass in resilience that really every person could learn from.
Well, speaking of history, something that a lot of us are taught in history is what happened to Anne Frank and the diary that came out. And you tell a rather shocking story of an employee at the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. What happened there?
Yeah, so this was something that happened in 2018 at the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. It's a museum where there are these tiny rooms where Anne Frank, this teenage Jewish diarist, and her family and others were hiding from Nazi persecution. It's now a blockbuster museum. They get millions of visitors a year. There was a young Jewish man who was working at this museum in 2018, and the museum would not allow him to wear his yarmulke to work. So that's this little skull cap that religious Jewish men often wear. The museum would not allow him to wear the yarmulke to work. He appealed this decision to the board of the museum, which deliberated for 4 months and then relented and let him wear his yarmulke to work. And I had seen this news story, and I just thought, 4 months is a really long time for the Anne Frank Museum to ponder whether or not it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. And, this incident really illustrated my point, which is, there's this need for living Jews to erase themselves in order for this story to go on about dead Jews that makes other people feel better about themselves.
And there has to be an impact on that individual. What impact is that?
Yes, on that individual, because he's being asked to erase himself, right? I mean, what you're basically being told is that, the dead Jews are here to teach us, all these wonderful lessons about humanity. And like, of course, like we all love the dead Jews. Like, those are the nice Jews. We don't like the yucky Jews who are doing things like, I don't know, practicing Judaism. I mean, it just exposes this hypocrisy. And I imagine, look, many Jews are schooled in this acts of resilience. And I'm sure this young man, was able to go on with his career. But I mean, it's just what it really reveals is something less about this young man than about this society that we live in, where Jews are expected to sort of perform this role.
I wanted to read a passage from the book that talks more about Anne Frank. And you write, the line most often quoted from Frank's diary are her famous words, "I still believe in spite of everything that people are truly good at heart." These words are inspiring, but which mean that they flatter us. They make us feel forgiven for those lapses of our civilization that allow for piles of murdered girls. And if those words came from a murdered girl, well then, we must be absolved because they must be true. It is far more gratifying to believe that an innocent dead girl has offered us grace than to recognize the obvious. Frank wrote about people being truly good at heart before meeting people who weren't. I have a few questions to ask about that quote. But why do you think that line resonates with so many people? I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart.
Well, as I say in the passage you shared, it flatters us, right? It makes us feel like, we've been absolved for, our civilization's sins. Like, oh, look, even this murdered Jewish girl has absolved us of our sins, and I mean, look, there's this deep theology from Christianity that this is playing into. But I mean, the problem is, like, in order to treat Anne Frank's diary as a work of inspiration, you have to dump the whole reality. There's nothing inspiring about this story. This teenager was murdered. And I mean, the other thing that I write about in that essay is, yeah, she was able to write this line about people being good at heart 3 weeks before she met people who weren't. I mean, if she had survived these Nazi extermination camps, maybe she would have had something else to tell us.
Mm-hmm. And you also talk about her as a fuller individual, that she didn't want to just be seen as a child. And she also had aspirations of being a great writer, but because she was murdered, she wasn't able to pursue that.
Yes. Well, so, right, there's other line that often is plastered on the cover of that book, which is a line where she says, I want to go on living even after my death. And that's used by publishers as if to say, like, oh, look, her dream came true. This book was published. It's like, no, you kill someone when they're 15 and then you claim that this was their work. I mean, I was a writer when I was 15. What I was doing when I was 15 isn't what I'm doing now at 44. And yes, she had what's amazing about that diary is that she was already at 15 thinking like a writer. She started writing that diary at 13 when her family went into hiding. But, she had heard a radio broadcast 2 years later about how asking Dutch civilians to preserve personal war documents for documentation after the war. And at that point, she started revising her diary with an intent toward publication. I mean, those are sophisticated revisions. She also was working on novels. She was working on short stories. I mean, and this idea that we're now going to put up this diary is like, oh, look, it's this innocent child's voice, stammering from the abyss. It's like, that's not what was happening. This is someone who was developing an adult writer's voice, right? And who was fighting with every aspect of her being against that idea of being this, like, being seen as this, like, oh, I'm this innocent little child who has no autonomy.
And I want to read another excerpt from your book because there's so much to unpack in this book. I wish we had more time. But you write, Holocaust novels that have sold millions of copies both in the United States and overseas in recent years are all uplifting, even when they include the odd dead kid. The Tattooist of Auschwitz, a recent international mega bestseller touted for its true story, manages to present an Auschwitz that involves a heartwarming romance. Sarah's Key, The Book Thief, The Boy in Striped Pajamas, and many other bestsellers, some of which have even become required reading in schools, all involve non-Jewish rescuers who risk or sacrifice their own lives to save hapless Jews, thus inspiring us all. What's wrong with that narrative?
Quite a few things. First of all, non-Jewish rescuers during the Holocaust there weren't a whole lot of them. That was statistically insignificant. Frankly, as are stories of Holocaust survival was statistically insignificant for European Jews. I mean, like, there's very, very few Christian rescuers in the story of the Holocaust. And yet, that's what most of these novels are about, because we want there to be like a happy story about inspiration. So that's one piece that's disturbing. Another piece is this need that we have to turn this into a feel-good story. If you're learning about the Holocaust, this story should not make you feel good. It should not make you feel good. It is a story of the triumph of evil. Why are we treating it like it's a story of inspiration? That is this absurdity. And that's, again, it's erasing the actual genocide of the Holocaust. The other thing that's erased is that, and by these stories about Christian rescuers, is the actual voices and autonomy of people who died in the Holocaust. And the way those people are portrayed is also extremely distorting, because generally what happens is that the content of Jewish culture itself is erased.
Do you think that this is more about, and it sounds kind of gross to say this, but do you think that it's done more to market the book so that it appeals to everybody?
Well, I think that's how the books are written, is to appeal. It's like, yay, it has universal appeal. But that idea of universal appeal is what I'm fighting back against in my book, because that universal appeal is itself has an evil component, because what basically we are doing is we are paying lip service to diversity in order to make people conform. And what I mean by that is that we are teaching anti-bigotry education by saying, oh, see this group of people who you might be bigoted against? You shouldn't be mean to those people, because those people are just like everybody else. They're just like you and me. Look, here's this kid on the soccer team who died in the Holocaust. Well, what was really destroyed in the Holocaust was a 1,000-year-old Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jewish civilization. Not like the culture of people who played on a soccer team. That's what was destroyed. And that's what we're erasing. And this idea that we only want to honor people who are just like everyone else, just like you and me. That is what I mean by paying lip service to diversity in order to make people conform. And that's where that damaging message is being spread to the way we talk about anti-Jewish attacks even today.
Well, since you brought up diversity, which is a word that it's just like makes me cringe, but there is an increased focus on diversity and inclusion in Canada. We're going to talk about Canada because this is where we live, but also in the United States where you are. Is that helping Jews at all?
Well, this is what's interesting about it, is that the conversation about Jews is always been this like, oh, look, Jews are like just like everybody else. What I think is interesting is that message, which at times in Jewish history has been embraced by Jews hoping for acceptance and knowing that the stakes in non-Jewish societies have often been high, that message itself is kind of the opposite of the message of Judaism, because Judaism, Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everybody else.
And being harmed because they weren't like everybody else.
Yes, right. I mean, and it's the content of, Judaism is a counterculture that runs through the whole history of the West. Jews have never wanted to conform, right, to the societies in which they live, right? That was never the goal of Judaism. And it was also never the goal of Judaism to proselytize. The idea was, this is who we are. We don't have to be exactly the same as you. It's in a sense a model for pluralistic societies today, which is like, you don't need your neighbors to be exactly like you and to see the world your way. And, when you say the word diversity makes you cringe, well, the reason it I don't pretend to know your thoughts, but I think the reason it's become so cringy is because it is used to mean the opposite of what it should mean. Now we use it to mean we have a bunch of people with lots of different backgrounds who all see the world the same way and all think the same way. And that's what I'm pushing back against. And I think that's the challenge that Jewish culture presents to pluralistic societies now.
As the years go by, Holocaust survivors are dying. And one of the ways that we've been told as a society to remember what happened during the Holocaust is to go to Holocaust museums. But you actually say, you question how effective that is. What do you mean?
Well, I think a lot of these museums were built at a time where the idea was, their very well intentions was to sort of inoculate the public against anti-Semitism. But I mean, I know that certainly in the United States, a lot of these museums were built in the 1990s. We now have, it's 30 years later, sort of levels of anti-Semitic hate crimes and things like that are much higher than they were 30 years ago. So I think we can sort of question whether this is really effective or not. Another thing that I often, I've been writing books about Jewish culture for 20 years. And what I often would do is ask my readers, how many people here can name 3 concentration camps? And that's something many readers can do. I often then would ask readers, how many people here can name 3 Yiddish writers. 80% of the people who were murdered in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers, a famously literary civilization. Why do we care so much about how these people died if we're not at all interested in how these people live? And I think that what's missing from sort of, education about, if you really want to inoculate people against anti-Semitism, how about curiosity about the content of Jewish civilization? Why would that not be part of what we want to teach people in living in a pluralistic society?
Well, you write that when it comes to education about Jews, so much focus on the Holocaust can lead to people shrugging off other forms of anti-Semitism, saying, well, it's not the Holocaust. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think that, anybody who learns about the Holocaust, in a sense, as I mentioned earlier, I feel like people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. You go to a Holocaust museum, you will probably feel sad about what happened, but you also feel good about yourself because you're like, I would never do something like that. Like, well, yeah, okay, you probably wouldn't, but that's kind of a high bar, right? Are we really saying that, anything short of murdering 6 million people is kind of okay? Because that's sort of what happens, because then what you find is that when in the book, for example, I list, I give a list where I'm like, here are a bunch of things that are not the Holocaust. And it's everything from, trolling Jews on social media to expelling Jews from entire countries and seizing all their assets, which happened in about a dozen countries in the Muslim world in the 20th century. That's something we never talk about. And because, it looks great compared to the Holocaust. Look, they didn't murder all those people. Hooray. And, that's the thing that I find really disturbing is that, you're going to set this ridiculous bar. We also now have something that we often do with public figures where if somebody says something vaguely anti-Semitic, the remedy is take them to a Holocaust museum. The problem with that is that basically is cost free for that person because it does not require them to engage with living Jews.
Well, you document several times in the past few years when Jews were murdered in America with one attack in your neighborhood. And you write that people tend to justify it even in mainstream media. How do they do that?
So I was referring to a series of attacks that were against the Hasidic community in New York and New Jersey, the area where I live, just before the pandemic. And I read the news coverage of these attacks. I almost couldn't find a news article that didn't say something derogatory about the community being attacked in the process of reporting it. So the way they do it is they'll say something like, oh, this Hasidic Jewish community was gentrifying a minority neighborhood, which is kind of remarkable because, these are highly visible members of the world's most historically persecuted minority. These aren't white hipsters. And also is there this murderous rage against gentrification where people are, bursting into coffee shops with automatic weapons? Because that's really not what's happening. And why are we pretending that it is? Or else they'll say something like, oh, there was this zoning battle between Hasidic and non-Hasidic residents of this town. And I'm like, okay, but we're talking about a machete attack here. Do we normally resolve municipal disputes with a machete?
And the answer is no,
what's going
of course.
on is,
yeah,
right. I mean, this is victim blaming, right? I mean, it's like if you were writing a news article about a woman who was sexually assaulted, would you be spending half that article talking about what she was wearing and how she provoked the attack? Mm-hmm. I don't think you would.
We talked about social media a little bit. You touched on that and the media itself. Another place, and you also mentioned, what life is like for people with Jewish names on social media. The other, I guess, part of this conversation is politics. We don't have a million hours, but do you, when it comes to anti-Semitism, hate is hate. But is there a difference between anti-Semitism coming from politicians on the left as opposed to those on the right?
The excuses which they give for it are different, but otherwise it's not different. I mean, I think that the reason that anti-Semitism is so attractive to people is because... You
say it's attractive?
I think the reason, it's not attractive to me. It's hopefully not attractive to most people. But the reason people are attracted to it is because it basically allows you to blame somebody else for your problems, right? Everybody wants to blame someone else for their problems. So the way you do that might be different on the right versus on the left. The thing that is a little bit unusual about anti-Semitism among bigotries is that it's a conspiracy theory. So what that means is it's not only, oh, these people are inferior to me, but it's also, oh, these people have too much power. And so then, you can make yourself look like you have, you're punching up if you're attacking Jews, like you're speaking truth to power. I mean, this is very, very old anti-Semitic trope. So that's, about a century ago, that I forget which thinker who calls anti-Semitism the socialism of fools. So there's that kind of dynamic. It's very flexible. It works on the right or on the left.
You mentioned that at the very beginning we talked about you feeling haunted and how you're very aware of time, and as time marches on, how things might change, but they don't really change. Having written this book, have you come to a place where you feel maybe less haunted?
I feel more aware of certainly what my own ancestors in the past have gone through. I feel more tied to that history, but I also feel, in a sense, more hopeful than when I published it, than when I wrote it. I feel more hopeful now than I did when I wrote it because, in some senses, as I mentioned earlier, I wish people liked it a little less. This is a very familiar feeling to a lot of people. But one thing I've encountered also is how many people in our society, and this is throughout North America, have been sort of stuck in this dynamic for many reasons. It's true for many minorities. It's true for many people in their own lives who have been sort of put into this position where, they're asked to erase their own identity in one way or another in order to, gain public respect. And I think that, we're now at a point in our conversation in pluralistic societies where maybe it would be possible to push past that. And so that's something that, I do feel hopeful about for the future.
Dara, thank you so much, and congratulations on the book. It is essential reading. It will make you uncomfortable, but I think that is the point, and we have to question why we're feeling uncomfortable. Thank you. Really do appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, December 9th, 2021. The new Omicron variant put everyone on alert. Tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka looks into whether we've taken the right precautions to keep it in check. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The Agenda is always on. To catch up on conversations from this week or any week, visit our website, tvo.org/theagenda. or our YouTube page at youtube.com/theagenda. It's all there for whenever you want to watch.